They built a fence on my land, and I didn't even realize it at first, not until the whole thing had already settled into place like it belonged there. And when I finally understood what was happening, I had two choices: fight it loud and fast, or watch quietly and let the system do what it does best. I chose the second one. My name is Ethan Cole, and this is how a few feet of dirt behind my house ended up bringing an entire property dispute crashing down in a way nobody in Cedar Hollow saw coming. It started in the most ordinary way possible, the kind of morning you forget 5 minutes after it happens. I was taking out the trash, coffee still half warm in my hand, when I noticed a fresh wooden fence running along the back of my property line where there had never been anything but open grass and a thin line of old shrubs. At first I actually laughed, because it looked harmless, like someone just decided to tidy things up, but something about it didn't sit right. The posts were too new, the alignment too clean, and it had clearly gone up over a single weekend when I was out of town. Cedar Hollow is one of those quiet places tucked into the western edge of Oregon, where everybody thinks they know where everything belongs, even when nobody actually measured anything properly in 20 years, and my place sits at the end of a gravel road where the county kind of stops caring. 8 acres of uneven ground, pine clusters, a small seasonal creek, and a backyard that fades into a natural tree line that has always been the unofficial border between me and the property behind mine. The neighbor back there was a man named Marcus Hale, mid-40s, always polite from a distance, but the kind of guy who spoke with certainty even when he had none. I didn't think much of him at first, just a guy with a big lot and a newer house who kept mostly to himself. That changed the same afternoon my lawn service guy showed up, an older guy named Ron who had been cutting my grass for 3 years without ever saying anything dramatic until that day. He stepped out of his truck, looked past me toward the fence, and just said, almost casually, "You know your property actually goes past that line, right?" I remember laughing because I thought he was joking, but he wasn't smiling. He said he had always cut a little deeper into the back corner than most people would expect, and that the natural slope didn't match where that fence was sitting. That was the first crack in the picture I had of my own land. The first moment I realized I might not actually know my own boundaries as well as I thought I did. That night, I pulled out the closing documents from when I bought the property, papers I hadn't looked at in years, folded maps with faint lines and measurements that suddenly felt more important than anything else in the house. I spread them across my kitchen table, tracing the boundary line with my finger under a dim light, and that's when I saw it. My property didn't end where I had assumed it did. It extended a few feet beyond the tree line, a quiet strip of land that I had never paid attention to, and that strip overlapped directly with where Marcus had just built his new fence. I remember sitting there for a long time just staring at it, not angry yet, just unsettled in a way that's hard to explain, like finding out a room in your house has been used by someone else without you noticing. The next morning I walked over to Marcus's side of the property, holding the map printed out, trying to keep everything calm because at that point I genuinely believed this was just a misunderstanding. He was in his yard when I approached, watering plants like nothing was wrong, and when I introduced the issue, I kept my tone light, almost friendly, telling him I thought the fence might be a little off the line and that we should probably double-check the survey before anything else got complicated. He smiled in a way that didn't quite match the situation and said the previous owner of his home had told him the boundary was right along that fence line, and that he had no reason to think otherwise. Then he added, "It's just a fence, man. Nobody's getting hurt here." That sentence should have been a warning, but I let it go. I told him we could look into it together, maybe even bring in a surveyor if needed, and he agreed easily enough, too easily in hindsight, like he was agreeing just to end the conversation. I went home thinking this would resolve itself quickly, but weeks passed, and nothing changed. The fence stayed exactly where it was, and slowly I started noticing other things, small things at first, like lawn chairs appearing near the back line. Then a fire pit set up one weekend right on the strip between our properties, as if that space had quietly been reassigned. I didn't confront him again right away because I kept telling myself people make mistakes with boundaries all the time, especially in rural areas where old markers get lost and nobody really updates anything properly. But the feeling of being ignored started to grow heavier each day. Then came the shed. It arrived in panels on a flatbed truck like it belonged in a construction catalog, not a disputed backyard, and within 2 days it was fully assembled. Gravel base, wired electricity, a small light glowing inside at night like it had always been meant to sit there. And the worst part was that a portion of it clearly extended past the fence line, deeper into what my map said was my land. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, but clarity. Because this was no longer confusion or misunderstanding. This was expansion. Intentional or not. It had crossed a line that paper didn't leave much room to debate. I called a surveyor the next morning, paid the fee without hesitation even though it wasn't cheap, and told myself I just needed facts, nothing more. When the surveyor arrived, he didn't say much. Just walked the land with his equipment, marking points with bright flags that looked almost too simple to carry so much weight. I followed him in silence, watching each marker go into the ground like a quiet verdict. And then he stopped, looked back at me, and said the words I already knew were coming but didn't want to hear out loud. The fence was 8 feet onto my property, and the shed was even worse, 5 feet beyond that, fully inside my land. I remember standing there staring at those little colored flags moving slightly in the wind, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't panic anymore. It was finality. Hard proof doesn't argue, it just exists. I thanked him, took the documents, and that night I sent everything to Marcus with a calm message, no accusations, just facts, suggesting we resolve it before it turned into something expensive for both sides. I expected a response, even a defensive one, but instead there was nothing. No reply, just silence. And then, a few days later, I saw Marcus outside sitting in one of those lawn chairs right inside the flagged zone, almost deliberately placed there, like he was reclaiming the space through presence alone. He didn't look at me when I walked out, just leaned back and said casually that people tend to treat land like it belongs to whoever uses it most. That time kind of builds ownership in its own way. I didn't respond right away, because in that moment I realized we weren't having the same conversation anymore. I was talking about property lines, and he was talking about entitlement. And that gap between those two ideas was about to turn everything into something neither of us could walk back from. I didn't sleep much after that conversation with Marcus, sitting in my own backyard watching him treat a strip of my land like it was already absorbed into his life. And the strange part was how quickly the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a test, like he was waiting to see what I would do next, whether I would escalate or back down, or just accept it the way people sometimes accept small injustices when they don't feel worth the trouble. But this wasn't small anymore. Not after the survey flags, not after the shed, not after the words time builds ownership. So the next morning I called a lawyer in the nearest town over in Millridge, a quiet office above a hardware store where the receptionist didn't even ask many questions, just scheduled me in like they had seen this story 100 times before. And when I explained everything, the attorney, a woman named Dana Wells, listened without interrupting, which already told me she understood exactly where this was going. She leaned back in her chair, tapped a pen against her notebook, and said something I didn't expect. She said disputes like this almost never start with bad paperwork. They start with assumption, then habit, then entitlement. And by the time anyone notices, it's already built into something expensive to undo. She told me I had done the right thing getting a certified survey, because without that everything becomes opinion, and opinion doesn't hold up when the city gets involved. That word stuck with me, city, because until then I had been thinking neighbor versus neighbor, but she was already thinking jurisdiction, codes, enforcement, structure, compliance, and that shift changed everything about how I saw the problem. She gave me one simple recommendation, not dramatic, not aggressive, just procedural: file a zoning compliance complaint, let the city inspect, let them determine setbacks and permit validity. Don't argue personality, argue code. So that's what I did. I walked into the Cedar Hollow Municipal office the next day, filled out a 1-page form, attached the survey, attached photos, and left it on a counter under fluorescent lights that made everything feel more official than it should have been. And then I waited, which turned out to be the hardest part, because waiting in a situation like this doesn't feel passive. It feels like tension building under your skin every time you look out the window and see the same fence still standing where it shouldn't be. And during that waiting period, Marcus escalated in his own way, not through calls or messages, but through presence. He started using that strip of land more openly. Weekend gatherings, a small grill, music playing late in the evening, just loud enough that I could hear it through my kitchen window, like he was trying to normalize it, like repetition could rewrite geography. and I found myself standing at the back door more often than I wanted to, just watching, trying to decide whether I was being pushed or whether I was just finally seeing what had been there the whole time. Ron, my lawn guy, noticed it too. He said one afternoon, while loading his mower, that people like that usually don't believe anything is real until someone with authority tells them otherwise. And I remember thinking how strange it is that authority is what turns obvious things into enforceable things, because without it, even a fence can become a kind of argument, not a boundary, just a claim. About a week later, the city inspectors arrived in a white truck with clipboards and measuring wheels, two of them, calm, professional, the kind of calm that only comes from doing this job repeatedly. They walked the entire back line, asked Marcus questions. While he stood with his arms crossed pretending this was routine, they measured everything twice, took photos from multiple angles, checked permit records on a tablet right there in the yard, and I stood slightly behind them, feeling something tighten in my chest, because I already knew what they were going to find, but hearing it from them would make it irreversible. One of them finally spoke and confirmed the shed had a permit, but not for its current placement. The setback violation was clear. And more importantly, it crossed a recorded property line, which meant it wasn't just a building issue anymore. It was a compliance failure tied directly to land use. And when they said that, Marcus finally stopped pretending. He stepped forward and said there must be some mistake, that the previous owner had assured him everything was fine, and I could hear the frustration rising under his voice now. Not fear yet, just resistance. Like reality was something negotiable if you argued hard enough. The inspector didn't argue back. He just handed him the notice, 30 days to remove or relocate non-compliant structures. And that's when the tone of everything shifted, because once paperwork exists, it stops being a conversation and becomes a countdown. Later that evening, Marcus came to my door for the first time, not with the same confidence as before. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen, and his voice had changed, softer, almost careful. He said the city was being overly strict, that permits were confusing, that nobody gets hurt by a shed sitting a few feet one way or another. And then he said something that revealed everything. He asked if I would just sign a consent form allowing the structure to stay where it was, like the problem could be solved by my signature alone, like law was just a suggestion until I refused to participate in it. I asked him quietly if he intended to purchase that portion of land from me, because that would be the only way this made sense, and he shook his head immediately. No, that's not necessary. Just permission, temporary understanding. We can keep things simple. But simplicity was gone by then. I told him I wasn't able to sign anything that contradicted the survey and the city findings. And that was the first time I saw something close to frustration break through his composure. Not anger yet, but disbelief that I wouldn't just adjust. And after that conversation, things went quiet again. But it wasn't peaceful quiet. It was waiting. Quiet. The kind that builds pressure without making noise. And then day 29 arrived with nothing changed. The fence still there, the shed still standing, the lights still on at night like it belonged there permanently. And I remember thinking he might actually try to outlast the deadline, rely on delay, paperwork fatigue, maybe even assume enforcement wouldn't follow through. But on day 31, the city did exactly what it said it would do. Fines began immediately, daily accumulation, no negotiation, and I watched from my kitchen window as that number started turning into something real, something unavoidable. And that's when Marcus stopped showing up outside altogether, and the next phase began. The contractor trucks arrived just after sunrise. Not dramatic, not loud in a cinematic way, just efficient, methodical, dismantling panel by panel, cutting through the base, disconnecting electricity, hauling everything away in sections like the structure had never been permanent at all. And the fence came down right after, posts pulled, holes filled, soil leveled, until the entire back line returned to what it had been before any of this started, just open ground, quiet air, and a space that finally matched the legal map instead of someone's assumption. And I stood there for a long time watching it disappear, not feeling victorious exactly, more like something had been corrected that should never have drifted in the first place. And Marcus never came out during the removal, not once. By the time the last truck pulled away, the backyard felt different in a way that had nothing to do with what was physically there. It was quieter, yes, but not just quiet in the sense of noise. More like the air itself had stopped carrying tension, like something that had been pressing against the space for months had finally been lifted. And I remember standing there early in the morning after it was all gone. Coffee in my hand again like that first day, I noticed the fence. Except now everything looked correctly aligned with reality instead of someone's interpretation of it. The ground was bare where the shed had stood, flattened gravel still visible like a ghost outline, and the fence line was nothing but disturbed soil slowly settling back into place. Marcus didn't come out during the removal, not once. And I didn't see him the next day either, or the day after that, and in a strange way that silence said more than anything he could have argued at that point. Because once enforcement finishes its job, there's nothing left to debate except what you chose to believe before it happened. A week later, I ran into Ron again while he was finishing another property down the road, and he didn't even bring it up directly. He just nodded toward my yard and said, "Looks like that sorted itself out." Like it was just another story that happens in places like this where land edges blur. Until someone finally decides to draw them sharply again. I asked him if he thought I handled it too far, and he shrugged and said, "You didn't do anything. The city did." And that stuck with me more than I expected, because he was right in a way that doesn't feel satisfying or dramatic, just factual. And maybe that's what made the whole thing so strange in hindsight. There was no moment where I fought Marcus directly in any real sense. No shouting match, no confrontation that solved anything. Emotionally, just documentation, measurement, and procedures slowly replacing assumption. But even with that clarity, I couldn't ignore the fact that this all started because someone believed proximity was the same as ownership. And I think about that a lot now when I walk to the back of my property and look at that line of trees, because it's easy to assume boundaries are obvious until someone treats them like they aren't. A month later, I got a short envelope in the mail from Marcus. No return address beyond his name, just a handwritten note inside. No apology exactly. More like a quiet acknowledgement that things had gone further than he expected. He wrote that he had relied on what he was told when he moved in, that he thought I wouldn't care about a few feet of unused land, and that he didn't think it would escalate the way it did, and he ended it by saying he hoped we could eventually move past it. I didn't respond, not because I was angry anymore, but because I didn't know what there was to say once the system had already spoken in full, and life around here moved on quickly the way it always does. Grass grows back. Gravel settles. People find new routines. But the interesting part is how something so small can permanently change the way you see everything around it. Now, every property line I look at feels less like a physical thing and more like a quiet agreement that only works as long as everyone respects it without testing it. And I think that's the real lesson buried in all of this. Not revenge, not victory, but how fragile assumptions become once they meet something measurable. And sometimes I wonder what Marcus tells his version of this story, whether in his mind it's about paperwork or fairness, or a system that didn't bend the way he expected it to. And maybe that's where this really ends, not with closure, but with two completely different memories of the same piece of ground. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of it, it's that land doesn't care what you believe about it. It only responds to what can be proven. So before I finish this, I want to ask you something directly. If you were in my place, standing there looking at a fence that didn't belong, would you have gone straight to the city like I did, or would you have handled it differently? And do you think Marcus truly believed it was his, or was he just betting I wouldn't push back? If this story made you think, let me know in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more real lifestyle stories like this, subscribe, because sometimes the quiet disputes are the ones that change everything the most.